Hello, welcome to World Talks here on TVP World. I'm your host, Marie Cato. Global attention on the escalating war in the Middle East, and the immediate question for Ukraine is whether the anticipated trilateral peace talks originally scheduled to take place in Abu Dhabi later this week will indeed happen. Joining me to talk about how the escalating attacks on Iran and the Middle East are affecting Ukraine is Andreas Umland, policy fellow at the European Policy Institute in Kyiv. Hello, sir. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me again.
So the immediate question is, will the trilateral peace talks scheduled for the 5th and 6th of March take place, in your opinion?
I think the main question now is whether the place will be the same as announced and whether maybe the location will be moved. But I would still hope that these talks will happen because in spite of my skepticism towards the general aims of these talks, usually these meetings had some positive results, namely the exchange of prisoners and partly also the return of some of the civilians that Russia has arrested in the occupied territories that were freed as a result of such bilateral talks.
Do you think that Moscow might take advantage of the chaos surrounding the Middle East crisis and push to delay it? Or do you think that the greater chance is that it would simply be relocated back to Geneva or somewhere else in Switzerland?
I do not expect that Moscow will somehow move these talks because it's a theater anyway. It's not a serious negotiation from the Russian side anyway. It's largely made for Trump to show Donald Trump that Russia is allegedly ready for compromise and for negotiations and for a ceasefire. And now, of course, perhaps the motivation for Russia to go for some serious negotiations is even lower because perhaps people in Moscow are calculating that the repercussions of the war with Iran will be such that they improve Russia's position rather than Ukraine's position. But Russia had in any way not planned, I think, to bring these talks to a meaningful end. So the main topic of these talks are a ceasefire and a compromise and concessions, and Russia was in any way not ready for this. So I don't think it changes in principle the situation, and Russia may agree to continue this theater at another location in Geneva or somewhere else.
What do you think is the likelihood that Ukraine will cooperate with the Gulf states in exchange for a brokered ceasefire? We know that President Zelensky has initiated some conversation in regards to this.
I think it's a smart move. It also draws attention to the link between Iran and Russia and to the link of the war with Iran to the Russian-Ukrainian war. Whether this will have some sort of real effects, real advantages for Ukraine remains to be seen. Indeed, I could imagine that there are now several countries around the world who are interested in Ukraine's experience with the drones that were originally constructed in Iran and then sort of remade by Russia and are now attacking Ukraine almost every night. But I don't see yet that this will have a major impact on the negotiations and on the chances for a ceasefire.
Do you think that in the broader context of these events, do you sense that perhaps Ukraine will be sidelined in the overall context? There are comments that Operation Epic Fury will perhaps impact the military and financial support that the US might provide for Ukraine.
Well, one has to say, first of all, that the support that the US is still providing is in material terms not any longer aid. It's instead weaponry that is bought by European countries for Ukraine, and it's good business for the US military-industrial complex. But nevertheless, I see now indeed the danger here that simply the capacities of the American military-industrial firms may not be sufficient to meet the demand of these two wars, the war in the Near East and the Russo-Ukrainian war. And that could then be indeed a problem for Ukraine if it cannot get, for instance, enough, Patriot anti-air defense missiles. But we'll see how that develops. As I said, it's this American help for Ukraine is now simply business for American companies, and that's why I hope that this sort of delivery of American weaponry will continue.
And I wanted to ask about the perception of this escalating Middle East conflict from the point of view of Russia, because obviously we know about the alliance between Iran, China and Russia. Earlier in the day, I spoke about the perception from the point of view of China, but I wanted to ask you about how Russia perceives this situation.
Well, Russia is losing one of its major allies internationally, it seems, at least if the regime changes in Iran and the foreign policy changes. I expect that to happen, although we may not see a totally new regime in Iran. On the other side, Russia would be clearly winning from this war if it leads to a longer rise of the oil price. The price of oil has already grown, and the question is now how long and sustained this higher oil price will be, and that is obviously to the advantage of Russia as an oil exporting country. And in that way, this is bad news for the Russo-Ukrainian war. And the other aspect we already mentioned before is that the war in the Near East is distracting, of course, international attention from the Russo-Ukrainian war, and also from the larger importance of the Russo-Ukrainian war as it is a war of territorial expansion by Russia. It's a genocidal war. It's a war of an official nuclear weapon state and against an official non-nuclear weapon state. So this is something that is now perhaps not as important for many people, and that is, of course, regrettable.
But with the rising oil prices and perhaps the decreased attention on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, does this essentially weaken Europe's position in terms of financially, or in general, maybe not financially, but overall pressuring Moscow to bring this war to an end?
I think that has basically sort of the dependence here is not from what is happening on the ground, but what the perception will be of this war, and whether it will lead to a sort of demobilization and perhaps even disinterest in European capitals for the Russo-Ukrainian war. But I hope that this will not happen, and that people will understand that in a way, these two wars are also connected through this alliance between Iran and Russia, and that, on the contrary, the support from Europe for Ukraine has to rise, both in terms of help for Ukraine and in terms of sanctions against Russia.
Okay. Andreas Umland, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
And that's all for World Talks. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you very soon. Goodbye.